My mother told my sister's fiancé I was unemployed. She said it lightly at the dinner table, the way you mention someone's old embarrassing nickname. What she didn't know was that the man she was managing his impression of had spent 14 months trying to hire me. And what nobody at that table knew, what I hadn't even fully processed yet, was that 9 months later, I would be standing on a scaffold inside my sister's wedding venue, restoring the ceiling above the room where her wedding would happen. My family introduced me as the sister who couldn't find her footing. I was the person responsible for making their most important night beautiful. They just didn't know it yet. Let me tell you how I got there. Because this story starts the way most important ones do. Not with a grand moment. With a small humiliation at a dinner table, and a man who didn't laugh when everyone else did. My name is Ingrid Marsh. I am 34 years old. I restore things for a living: paintings, furniture, ceilings, staircases. The kind of work where, if you do it right, nobody notices you did anything at all. They just walk into a room and feel like it was always beautiful. I trained for 6 years under a man named Abe Fletcher, a conservator who ran a small studio 2 towns over from where I grew up. My studio now sits above a hardware store on Cobb Street. The sign out front says Marsh Restoration, not Ingrid Marsh, just Marsh. I picked it that way on purpose, a long time ago, and I told myself it was professional habit. That wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I grew up in a house where being noticed was dangerous, and some part of me had learned to build a business the exact size and shape of a woman who stays out of the light. I have one sister, Brooke. She is 2 years younger than me, and she was built for rooms like the one I'm about to describe. Pageant training since she was 6. A smile that never has to think about where the corners of her mouth are going. She is not a cruel person. I want to say that clearly, early, because it matters later. She is a product of our mother's world. Our mother is Sandra. Sandra has spent her adult life making our family sayable, presentable, explainable in one sentence at church, at the salon, at any table where someone might ask a follow-up question. My career has never fit into one sentence, so for most of my adult life, my mother has treated it less like something to be proud of, and more like a stain she had to keep pre-treating. The dinner happened on a Thursday in April 11 months ago now. Brooke had just gotten engaged to a man named Grant Whitfield, and this was the first time the whole family would sit down with him. My mother had the good tablecloth out, the one that only comes out for people she is trying to impress. I noticed the tablecloth before I noticed anything else. In my house, you read the room before you spoke in it. You could tell how the evening was going to go by which dishes came out. Grant sat across from me. He had a quiet, watchful way about him, the kind of stillness some people mistake for shyness and I mistook at first for boredom. I didn't know yet that stillness in some people is just where their attention lives. Before anyone had said a single interesting thing that night, I noticed the looks. My mother glancing at me the way you check a stove you're worried about. My father, Tom, keeping his eyes on his plate the way he does when he can feel weather coming. Brooke bright and talking fast, filling silence before it could open up and swallow something. It happened right after Grant turned to me and asked, simply, kindly, what I did for a living. I remember exactly how my mother sounded when she answered before I could. Light and quick, like she was doing everyone a favor. Ingrid's between things right now, she said, and then, smiling around the table like she was letting them all in on a joke. Don't embarrass us, Ingrid. The table laughed. Everyone laughed except Grant. He didn't laugh, and he didn't look away from me either. He just tilted his head slightly, the way you do when a fact doesn't match the room it's sitting in, and he said, between things, what did you do before? I gave him the short version, the version I always gave. I said I did restoration work, old buildings, old objects, that kind of thing. It's true, and it's also a sentence built to end a conversation, which is exactly what I wanted it to do at that table. Grant didn't let it end. He asked what kind of restoration, and I told him mostly historic interiors, plaster work, ceilings, staircases, that sort of thing. And I watched something shift in his face, not polite interest, recognition. He pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a second and turned the screen toward me, and it was a photograph of a coffered ceiling I had restored 2 years earlier in a courthouse 3 states away, the kind of job that had taken me 4 months and had my initials, tiny, in the corner of the plaster where only another conservator would think to look. This is yours, he said. It wasn't a question. I've seen this photograph a dozen times. My family's foundation has been trying to reach the person who did this work for over a year. We couldn't find a name, just initials and a studio that doesn't answer emails. 14 months, it turned out later, once we compared dates. 14 months of a family with real money and real reach trying to hire me and not being able to find me because I had built my whole professional life to be unfindable. I watched my mother's face do the thing it does when a story stops going the way she scripted it. A small recalculation behind the eyes. Then she smiled again, a different smile, and said, "Ingrid dabbles in that sort of thing. It's a nice hobby for her." Grant looked at my mother for a moment, and then back at me, and what he said next, I will never forget, because it was the first time in years someone had corrected the story about me at that table without hesitating. "A hobby," he said, quietly, "doesn't get referenced in 3 architectural journals." Nobody laughed that time. The rest of dinner went the way dinners in my family go after something true has slipped out. Fast talk, fast subject changes, my mother steering everyone toward the wedding venue, a historic building called Fairmont Hall that the Whitfield family's Preservation Trust had recently purchased and was restoring. I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that the safest thing to do once you've been seen is to disappear again quickly before anyone decides to punish you for it. Under the table, my father's hand found my knee for just a second, one quiet squeeze, gone before anyone could have noticed it. That squeeze was its own full sentence. "I see you. Hold on." I drove home with the windows down even though it was cold, because I needed the noise of the road to fill the space where my own thoughts were too loud. I kept hearing, "Don't embarrass us." I kept hearing the table laugh. When I got upstairs, I opened my laptop and there was an email waiting from the Fairmont Preservation Trust, a formal invitation, dated that same week, asking whether Marsh Restoration would consider taking on the ceiling and staircase of Fairmont Hall. I sat there a long time with the cursor blinking, my mother's voice still in my ears, and I understood, even before I opened the attached photographs, that I was about to spend the next several months building something my family would have to walk under. I said yes 2 days later, before I let myself think too hard about it. It was only after I hung up that I opened the venue's website and saw, in the events calendar, a date in December already marked private booking. I called back and asked whose wedding it was. Whitfield Marsh. My sister's wedding was booked in the room I had just agreed to restore. I could have said no. I sat with it for one whole night, and by morning I understood something simple. I had spent 12 years being good at this work in private. I was not going to turn down the best commission of my career because it might make my mother uncomfortable. My mother came to the studio for the first time in 4 years that May. She stood in the doorway looking at the drop cloths like they might get on her coat, and she said she wanted to talk to me about the Fairmont contract, woman to woman. She sat down and told me she would give me $25,000 to withdraw from the job. She said Brooke's wedding needed to be about Brooke, not about Ingrid's project, and that having me on scaffolding in the room for months beforehand would confuse things for people. I asked her what exactly it would confuse. She didn't answer that directly. What she said instead, and this is the sentence that told me more about her than anything else that day, was, "People will ask why you're up there, and I won't know what to tell them." That was the whole operating system, laid out plainly on my work table. It was never really about Brooke's day, it was about my mother not having a sentence ready. I told her I wasn't withdrawing, and she left without finishing her coffee. The scaffold went up in Fairmont Hall the first week of June. The ballroom ceiling there is a coffered dome painted with a mural of the Four Seasons, done sometime around 1911 by an artist nobody had ever properly credited. 60 years of water damage and one very bad amateur repair in the 70s had left whole sections cracked, flaking, one corner of the winter panel gone almost entirely to bare plaster. For 9 months, most days, I climbed 40 feet of scaffold before the building opened and worked until the light through the clear-story windows went orange. I mixed lime plaster by hand in small batches because that's what the original material called for. I matched 4 different blues for the winter sky before one of them finally sat right next to a century of sun-faded original paint. The first time I ever heard the sentence that runs underneath everything I do, I was 24, standing on a much smaller scaffold, watching Abe Fletcher run his thumb along a hairline crack in a chapel ceiling instead of covering it over the way I'd assumed he would. He said, "We don't hide the cracks, Ingrid. We make them strong enough to hold." I understood it better every month I spent above that ballroom. In August, the Preservation Trust sent a documentary crew to film the restoration for an archive piece, and their coordinator asked me to sign a media release. I told her I wasn't interested in on-camera interviews. She said gently that stories like this one don't usually stay unnarrated. Someone always ends up telling it. She asked whether I'd rather that someone be me. I told her I'd think about it. Grant's mother, Vivian Whitfield, came by the site in September. She was the first person of my mother's generation who had ever looked at my work and asked about it the way an expert asks. She stood under the scaffold for 20 minutes asking about pigment sourcing, and when I told her about matching the blues, she said, "That's the hardest part of this whole ceiling, and you did it in 4 tries. Most people take 10. I had to turn around and pretend to check a bucket. It was Vivian's assistant, Mrs. Aldis, who forwarded me an email chain in October. A thread going back 3 years, invitations, lecture requests, a Regional Preservation Award nomination, all addressed to Marsh Restoration, all replied to and declined in a voice that was not mine, from the general inbox my mother had access to from the years she'd helped me set up my first website and never gave back the login. I read the whole thread twice. My mother had been declining professional invitations in my name for 3 years, not deleting them, declining them, politely, so nothing would ever come back around and force a conversation. The feeling wasn't rage, not yet. It was closer to vertigo, the sense of a floor you'd trusted turning out to have been tilted the whole time. I didn't call her that night. I saved the thread to a folder and closed the laptop, and I climbed the scaffold the next morning at 6, because the winter panel still needed 3 more weeks, and because the work was the one part of my life nobody had ever managed to get their hands on. My father showed up at the studio in November with a box of shortbread cookies, and I understood, the second I saw him standing there without my mother, that he had come to tell me something he'd been carrying a long time. My father is a quiet man, not passive in the way people mean when they say that word like an insult, quiet the way a load-bearing wall is quiet. He doesn't say much, but he knows more than anyone in our family gives him credit for, and he has spent 30 years absorbing my mother's weather so the rest of us wouldn't have to. He told me about my mother's father, my grandfather, who I only ever knew as a quiet man in a recliner who died when I was 9. My grandfather was the janitor at the high school my mother attended. My father said my mother never talked about it, except one night early in their marriage, when she told him about a specific sound. The pageant girls used to squeak their shoes on purpose when they walked past him in the hallway. New shoes, the kind that squeak on waxed floors, and everyone would laugh, and my mother would keep her eyes on the floor and pretend the man mopping it wasn't her father. For one whole winter, my grandfather stuffed newspaper into the soles of his own shoes because he couldn't afford a second pair, and the newspaper made a different sound than the girls' new shoes, a sound my mother said she could pick out of a hallway of noise for the rest of her life. I want to be honest about what that story did to me. It gave me a floor plan for a house I'd been living in my whole life without understanding its architecture. My mother had spent her childhood being the daughter of the man everyone laughed at, and she had built her entire adulthood into a fortress against that sound ever reaching her again. My existence, unmanaged and unexplained, was a squeaking shoe in a hallway she had spent 40 years trying to keep silent. Understanding a wound does not obligate you to keep bleeding for it. I could hold my mother's history with real tenderness and still refuse to keep disappearing so she could feel safe. Both things were true at the same table. The formal wedding invitation arrived that same week. My mother called an hour after I opened it, and she had terms ready, the way she always has terms ready. She said I could come as the sister between jobs, her exact words. She said it would be one evening, that all she was asking was one evening where I let the wedding be about Brooke, said nothing about the ceiling, and let people assume whatever they wanted about what I did with my time. I told her I'd think about it, and I hung up, and I sat with the RSVP card on my work table for exactly 1 hour. Then I filled it out. Ingrid Marsh, it said, on the line for the guest's name, and underneath, conservator, Marsh Restoration. I walked it to the mailbox at the corner that same hour before I could talk myself out of it. Brooke came to the studio 2 weeks later, unannounced, the first time she'd ever seen the Fairmont ceiling in person. She stood under the scaffold for a long time with her neck craned back, not saying anything, which is not like her. When she finally spoke, her voice had a shake in it I'd never heard from her before. "I didn't know you could do this. she said. We talked for a while, easier than we had in years, and somewhere in the middle of it, without any edge in her voice at all, she said the sentence that told me more about our whole family's architecture than anything else in this story. "You're lucky, Ing," she said. "Nobody expects anything from you." She meant it as something close to envy, but what she was actually describing was 34 years of being written out of the family's expectations so thoroughly that even my own sister, standing directly underneath proof of what I could do, still reached first for the old story instead of the one in front of her. I didn't correct her. Some corrections have to happen slower than a single afternoon. The morning of the wedding, I stood in front of my mirror for a long time before I got dressed. 9 months of scaffold had put a permanent, low ache into my shoulders. I looked at my reflection and I did not see a woman between jobs. I did not see someone lost or waiting to be explained. I saw a woman with 9 months of a ceiling built into her shoulders, about to walk into a room she had made beautiful with her own hands, wearing her actual name on a card in an envelope that was, by then, already sitting on a table somewhere inside. Fairmont Hall on the night of the wedding did not look like the building I had spent 9 months inside. It looked like the building was always meant to look, which is the only compliment a restorer ever really wants. When the lights came up on the ballroom for the first time that evening, the Four Seasons mural burned overhead in full color, every panel restored, the winter sky finally the right blue. I watched 200 guests stop talking mid-sentence and look up. By the door, mounted in bronze, was a small plaque the Preservation Trust had commissioned without telling me until it was already installed. It read simply, "Ceiling and Staircase Restoration, Ingrid Marsh, Marsh Restoration." My full name, in public, at that scale, for the first time in my career. My mother found it before I did. I watched her stand in front of it for a moment, and then turn to the event coordinator nearby and say, in the same bright, managing voice she uses for everything, that the corner by the door felt bare, and had anyone considered a potted fern. That is the sentence I keep coming back to when I try to explain my mother to people who didn't grow up with her. Not cruelty, not exactly. A woman standing in front of her own daughter's name in bronze and reaching instinctively for something to put in front of it. The documentary producer found me at my table about an hour into the reception. She asked if I'd reconsidered the interview, said they had 10 minutes at the end of the night if I wanted them. No pressure either way. I told her I'd let her know. It was right after that conversation that I felt my mother's hand close around my elbow. Firm, practiced, the same grip she'd used on me my whole childhood, steering without seeming to steer. She smiled at the people near us and said something about needing me for 1 minute, and she walked me through a service door into the back hallway before I fully understood we were leaving the room. The hallway was narrow, lined with folded banquet chairs, lit by one bare bulb. My mother let go of my arm and turned to face me, and for a second I saw something in her I hadn't seen in years. Not anger. Fear, close to the surface. She said it fast, like she'd rehearsed it on the walk over. "You have your plaque. You have your name on the wall. That's enough, Ingrid. Don't do the interview. Let tonight be Brooks." I remember the exact rhythm of it because it was the same rhythm as "Don't Embarrass Us" 11 months earlier, just dressed in more desperate clothes. I told her that everything in that room, the mural, the staircase, 9 months of my life on a scaffold, was already there because of me, whether or not anyone said my name out loud. The interview wasn't going to change what I'd built. It was only going to change whether she got to keep pretending she didn't know who built it. And then I said the thing I hadn't planned to say. I told her I knew about my grandfather, about the newspaper in his shoes, about the girls who squeaked theirs on purpose in the hallway while he mopped the floor they walked on. I watched something in my mother's face come apart for just a second, the managing woman stepping back and someone much younger standing in her place. I told her I understood now some of what she'd been running from her whole life. I told her I was sorry that had happened to her, and I meant it completely. But I told her I wasn't going to keep being the sound she was afraid of. I wasn't the squeaking shoe. I was just a woman who had done good work and wanted to be able to say so, once, out loud, in a room that had already seen the proof on its ceiling. "I'm only taking my name," I told her. "You can keep everything else." And I turned and walked back toward the door to the ballroom. Behind me, I heard the specific sound of my mother's hand releasing the sleeve of her own dress, which she'd been gripping the whole time without realizing it. A small, quiet letting go that nobody in that hallway but me would ever know had happened. I stepped back into the ballroom just as the lighting crew brought the chandeliers up to full for the first dance, and for a moment the whole room tipped its head back at once. 180 conversations stopped mid-sentence as the mural caught the light fully lit for the first time that night. I found the documentary producer near the east archway and told her I was ready. 10 minutes, one camera, no script. The host asked me what I'd done in that room. I kept it simple. I restored the ceiling, I said. The mural, the plaster, most of the coffers. It took 9 months. She asked what the hardest part had been, and I told her about the winter panel, about matching the blue 4 times before it finally sat right, and I told her about a man named Abe Fletcher who taught me the only rule I've ever needed for this work. We don't hide the cracks. We make them strong enough to hold. She asked, gently, whether there was anything else I wanted to say. I understood what she was really asking. I said the ceiling had been the honor of my career so far, and I meant it, and I let that be the whole answer. When the camera panned briefly across the room, it caught the family table. My mother had left the hall a few minutes before the lights came up. She told the people near her she had a headache. Nobody argued with her. Her chair sat empty for the rest of the night. She had chosen to leave rather than watch. I found my father standing at the edge of the parquet dance floor afterward, and when I came up beside him, I saw that he was crying, quietly, without any fuss about it. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Your grandfather would have loved that ceiling." That was all. It was enough. Later, I found Brooke standing in front of the bronze plaque by the door, still holding her bouquet, reading my full name over again like she was memorizing it. She didn't say much. She reached over and squeezed my hand, and I squeezed back, and we stood there together for a minute in a silence that felt like the beginning of an actual language between us, one we were only just starting to learn. In the months since, my studio has been booked 3 years out. I hired 2 apprentices in the spring, both women, both told by someone along the way that this kind of work wasn't really for them. I finally replaced the boiler that had been dying since I moved in. None of it happened because of one dinner or one plaque. It happened because the work was always good. It just took the room finally catching up to it. My mother still goes to the same church. From what Brooke tells me, she has started describing my work to the other women there in a general, gracefully vague way. Something about museums, something about historic buildings. She has never once used the word restoration in front of me since that night, and I've stopped needing her to. In the spring, a small package arrived at my studio with no note attached to the box itself, just a slip of paper tucked inside. My grandmother's teacup, the one that had sat on my mother's shelf my whole childhood, cracked clean through the handle at some point I never heard about. The note said only, "If you have time." No signature. I didn't need one. I mended it the way I mend the things I care about most, in the kintsugi style. Gold dust worked into the resin along the break instead of hidden underneath it. When it was finished, the crack didn't disappear. It caught the light instead, a thin gold seam running through white porcelain, visible on purpose. I packed it carefully and sent it back to my mother with no invoice, no note of my own. Some cracks, I have learned, you don't hide. You make them strong enough to hold, and then you let them show.